watching this YouTube video, and like the guy was going up to this. It was two people, a guy and a girl. The guy was clearly one of those conservative gotcha people. Like man interviews feminists, and the video title was "The One Question That Will Undermine the Feminist Narrative," and and all the comments were clearly haha, got him, and 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 so the guy went up to this girl who was clearly a feminist. She had a beret and the name tag and everything, feminist. And he went, look, you're a feminist, right? Yeah. Can I ask you a bit more about feminism? He said, yeah, sure. The narrative of feminism is that men oppress women. Am I correct? Yes. And then he went, well, what about this thing? During the slave trade and during when slave ownership was a thing, he pointed out black men were oppressed by white women, weren't they? If you were to rank everybody, and like where do people stand in terms of social status? All black men were under all white women. Doesn't that mean that that men don't really oppress women? And then a woman said, no, well, yes. And then she tried to say something about intersectional feminism, but as all conservative videos do, they cut off there because you always have to have a bad guy, and the bad guy can never say their piece. But I think that's a really good example of the difference between various forms of feminism, right? Like the guy was in a way right. He was whacking a version of feminism that was out there. Men oppress women, and he did undermine the narrative of feminism. He didn't annihilate or destroy feminism with facts and logic. He just kind of did something to it, and like I think that's what we're going to talk about today. Yeah. So
yeah, I actually watched this. I know this video. It's by Muhammad
This is a
Hijab.
real video?
Yes.
Okay, it's a real video.
This is a real video. I watched it like before dinner.
You think I'll make it up? Maybe the algorithm gods are giving this video to everybody who like occasionally debates, because this is one of those things that debaters see and they can't resist.
Oh, really?
Yeah, not
What
you,
are you
Sam.
insinuating? Huh?
I think, well, yes, it's true that there's various different strands of feminism, and different individuals have different interpretations of it and are willing to defend different types or like different goals within feminism. And what we're going to talk about today is how it applies specifically to Malaysia, or at least to third world countries in general. Since we cannot always take the styles of feminism that we see in the West, all that Beyonce empowerment, and yes, it's great and all, but does it really work in a third world country like ours? I don't know.
Active disclaimer, all of us are from very heavily urban areas. So we don't exactly have the exposure to the entire spectrum of Malaysian society. But we'll try our
the
best.
metropolitan city of Kuching, the thriving first world skyscrapers that
that envelop the sky.
Envelop the sky in steel and bone.
Yeah, disclaimer, we're all from, like, three of us are from Kuching and Sarawak. And well, I think we've all come pretty far from there. Okay, so let's talk about the different strands of feminism.
So we decided to talk about the different strands of feminism through their different waves, because arguably the different waves of feminism are the easiest way to categorize the different opinions that different feminists may have. So in the first wave, feminists dealt with enfranchisement, as well as equal contract and property rights for women. This means having the right to vote and having the right to own a house and own property the same way a man does. It's not exactly too relevant in Malaysia because when we were given independence as well as the right to vote, the British did not exactly discriminate based off gender. But of course, the access to these rights are different for a man and woman. But those factors are dealt with more strongly in the second and third wave. The first wave focused on making sure that they're there. The second wave and third wave dealt more with the access. The second wave specifically dealt with cultural and political inequalities. So a good author on this topic is Betty Friedan, and she wrote this book called The Feminine Mystique. So in it, she argues that it is okay for a woman to not feel fulfilled when all they're doing is just child rearing and homemaking, because the social construct at the time was that you should be happy doing what you do. uh, and it also sort of enforced the idea that women belonged in the kitchen or belonged in a home. So the second wave wanted to break this social construct. It's relevant to Malaysia because in certain areas we're still trying to normalize education for girls as much as we do for boys. So this means that it's okay to send your woman pula, your girl pula, your daughter overseas to access education. It is also about breaking the certain stereotypes that some career paths have. So, like, nurses aren't just a girl job, and doctors aren't a guy's job. You should be able to access both however you want, and you should do whatever you want with your future. Go and study, go and get a scholarship, and do whatever job that makes you happy. Don't uh, don't stay at home. It breaks the stereotype as well that a woman's main priority in life is to find a husband. So that's what the second wave deals with. The third wave dealt with intersectionality and sex positivity. So an author about this issue would be Naomi Wolf. She wrote about it in her book The Beauty Myth. So it argues for the expressions of femininity and female sexuality in a way that liberates women. So it's relevant internationally, probably when we talk about Beyonce and Cardi B, with their provocative videos and Cardi B's song, Wet Ass Pussy. So, like, many people would argue that this is bad for women because it objectifies them. But the third wave says no, I can reclaim my sexuality, I can express myself however I want. Um, it's your job not to objectify us. We want to be proud of who we are. So it's relevant to Malaysia when we talk about rape and catcalling, as well as the victim blaming associated with it. So if you don't want to be raped, if you don't want to be catcalled or sexually harassed, then you should dress less provocatively. Don't wear shorts, don't wear any revealing clothes, cover up your knees. And yeah, so like these things are what third wave feminists argue against. It's not about how we dress, it's about whether you can keep your stuff in your pants. It's also relevant when we talk about violence against women. So, Ivy Josiah is a leading feminist in Malaysia, and she has an organization that, um, helps women find refuge from domestic violence. I guess this is also relevant when we talk about the weak legislation Malaysia has when it comes to marital rape, because I think the current laws do not deal with the lack of consent, and that they only prosecute marital rape when it comes with with a threat of violence. While obviously the lack of consent is a very important issue, and third wave feminists will fight for that.
Third wave feminism happened while second wave feminism was still going on. So women still up to this day don't have workplace equality. But third wave feminism recognized that beyond workplace equality, there are other fights. So I believe the catalyzing moment for third wave feminism was the Anita Hill hearings on sexual harassment. And third wave feminism sort of starts to spread from the workplace and general gender roles and workplace equality to the finer points of what it means to have equality in society. You have your sexual harassments and the Me Too movement calling out sexual harassments. You have Butler's gender performativity theory that then opened up feminism to transgender people and non-binary people. When we start asking things like, what does it mean to be a woman? Where did our ideas of women come from? Do we teach them to children? Are we born with them? And are there women who have it even worse off than white women? Uh, like, do men oppress women? Like, from the story from the start, that's the sort of the narrative second and first wave feminism fought for. But third wave feminism sort of opened it up even further and said, actually, sometimes women oppress women, and sometimes women oppress men, and feminists sometimes have to also fight for men. When men are told to man up, are sort of exposed to ideas of masculinity that might not be positive for their own growth or development and for the growth and development of others. That's what third wave feminism ended up doing.
So, what do you guys think about feminism having to happen in stages? So, like, we cannot have third wave feminism unless we achieve the prior two stages. So, Ian mentioned how third wave happened while the second wave was still going on. Was that bad for the movement, or is that bad for people in general?
I think personally, I do think that skipping stages is something feminists can legitimately do, and we don't always have to have feminism based around your core ideas of property values and democratic voting, right? These are ideas that the West had, that were sort of core to the story or the narrative of the West. But in Malaysia, for example, women fight different fights, and sometimes the finer points are points that are extremely important. For example, the idea of hijab wearing, which Westerners don't really have to deal with. Sexual harassment, for example, could be harmful, whether or not it is done onto women who are who are getting equal pay in the workplace, for example. And a lot of the times, Malaysia gets its feminism story completely reversed. So we never had a situation where women were unable to vote or were unable to were unable to own property. We sort of skipped over first wave feminism, really, and so feminism as an idea sort of descended upon us from the West, and very often sort of takes root in our own societies without any Western influence at all. Like, there is a certain feeling that if we if certain stories are being told, like, if you study hard you will do well in life, they should be told to everybody, not only the boys. And I do think that you can essentially skip over stages of feminism if necessary, if your culture allows it, and you think that you'll benefit from it. For a lot of us here, as for example, we kind of just jumped right into feminism without even understanding the waves, and we went, oh, so that's where they came from, right? Like, we sort of accepted it as a wholesale package. Sexual harassment is very bad. Gender roles are bad, and especially those of us who never had to live through the three waves of feminism, it's like we learned it all as one package, and we went, oh, so these are where the individual parts of the package came from historically, but we all took it as one package. A very similar idea would be, human rights. We learned that there are different human rights, freedom from suffering, freedom for free and fair elections, freedom for a fair trial if we are ever accused, and freedom of speech. But we never actually had to go, oh, so the fair trial comes from Rome, the election comes from Greece. We never really had to go, okay, here, therefore we have to go for the Greek method first, and then the Roman method, and then the freedom of speech. We sort of get human rights as this big package, especially those of us who are born into a world where human rights are really defended internationally by organizations such as the UN, and just sort of given them out as this sort of list, and we go, okay, let's have all the human rights then, instead of having to start off with some human rights and progress to others.
So Ian, do you think there's ever a time when skipping stages, even if it means hurting women on the ground, do you think it's justifiable? Do you think it's okay?
So let me help you out with that. So I'll first steelman the argument, and then I'll refute it. So when you say hurting women on the ground, what I assume you mean is that skipping stages sometimes makes feminism feel weird, right? Like, if you're going and asking for the most radical things, like abolish gender, for example, which is a fight some feminists fight for, not all of them definitely, but some, or eradicate all color associations and begin fighting for like micro changes, like changes in language, for example, right? Where we are trying to change things like stop saying policeman, start saying police person, stop saying actress, start saying actor. These sort of fights, which came really in the third wave when and while the second wave was already doing fairly well, and the third wave was trying to refine its benefits. Uh, and so if doing these things and feminism that argues for these things doesn't end up arguing for earlier or more important things. So think Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? The most basic things are women not being beaten up, um, women, not and not being kept out of education or jobs altogether. Presumably, I'd say in that scenario, yes, but I don't see why that happens in all scenarios. So, you can tell a person, actually, here's why I personally think that you should stop saying mean things to women, while also fighting for broad political goals altogether. I don't think it in all instances feminism gets hurt when we do one and not the other.
So what about in situations like more specific to Malaysia, where some people in rural areas are arguing with their parents that they should be put like on a priority list, or like they should be sent to school just like their brothers. Like, do you remember that Form 5 novel that we had with Dawan Kwai? Yeah, I know you
One
guys
and
remember
quiet,
that.
I know.
Yeah, so like
Oh
Sing to the
god.
Dawn.
Oh
I
yeah,
kind of want to
Sing to
read it
the
again.
Dawn.
yes, so that book. Yeah, so we're taking that, and that's more like second wave feminism. You're struggling to get the
Yeah.
same rights as men. But like in other areas, more developed areas, even within the same state, you have people who are like, who are for the slut walk, for example. Doesn't it hurt the movement when, I don't know, like some people have a negative view of the overall movement as a whole, and then it affects other fights in the movement?
Mm. I think there's a danger of that. The answer is just be very nuanced, be very specific in explaining how certain feminists fight for certain things and how other feminists fight for other things. The slut walk movement has good points, right? You're trying to essentially erase the idea that sluts, as compared to bachelor or a player or player, for it the language that we use to describe women should not be unequal, and that is not that bad a claim, right? Like, why is it okay to call a woman a slut, but when you call a guy a player, it doesn't have that same punch. It doesn't feel like an insult. That's a legitimate fight to have, and you can have that fight in cities for the most part. But I'm not entirely sure I see that much of a link between feminists fight for slut walk and therefore I should not send my child to school, right? The link isn't always that strong. And if the link ever is there, so like how the conservatives in the comment section of the YouTube video were essentially saying, yes, feminism is undermined now that I've got them on this one point, because when you're trying to fight against a social movement, you find any reason that you can say, I hate these people. The answer to that, I think, for the feminist movement is to be very, very nuanced and to say, look, that's another wing of the fight. Sure, that's another thing. That's another conversation we can have about feminism. Right now, we're talking about your daughter, and she now has really high grades, and your son is a kind of a sack of potatoes. So why not send your daughter to school instead?
But for a lot of these people that find feminism as an idea very weird, accepting feminism as an ideal isn't really about accepting certain bits of feminism. I think in many cases, especially in developing nations, they see it as one whole package. And like you can see this in Malaysia where they talk about westernization and they treat the West as like this entire set of policies that you need to follow, even though there's multiple nuanced areas where it can function, right? Like, do you think in that context, traditional people or like conservative people within developing nations like Malaysia, you think it's possible for them to accept these bits of feminism?
I think that is an issue with language and the way we label things, really, because a lot of the times we have a habit of naming big issues and and sort of judging one part of the issue based off others. And the ability to be nuanced, at least I personally think, is that. And the ability to say, look, this is one part of our fight, that's another part of our fight. Right now, we're talking about this part. So, a good example of this would be a good example of this going wrong would be in America, where Republicans and Democrats have big platforms. You know, you could have a Democrat who fights for abortion rights. You could have a Democrat who then fights for gun reform and equal wages, or no, and minimum wages. I beg your pardon, and higher taxes on the rich. A conservative will go, haha, you fight for abortion and therefore you're evil. And then even if I'm a sort of is there even such a thing as a centrist now? Even if I'm a centrist or a fence sitter in America, and I sort of go, oh yeah, I actually agree with the Democrat. We ought to tax the rich more, and we ought to get rid of the guns. They might kill my son or my daughter. I really feel strongly about the abortion thing, and so I go, you know what? I'm just not going to vote for the Democrat or even vote for the conservative person. So if accepting feminism were this sort of binary yes or no, then maybe it would be very dangerous for us to actually go, oh yeah, you in order to accept feminism, you have to do all of these things. But accepting feminism, I feel, isn't something you do overnight with one big switch and go, I'm a feminist now, right? You be a feminist, or you perform parts of feminism based off your person. I am more of a feminist when I'm nicer, or at least not when I'm not a horrible man to women, and I'm more of a feminist when I don't don't look at a politician who's female and go, oh, they won't be able to do the job. I'm more of a feminist, and so maybe even if it doesn't get them, even if it makes sure that even if they don't end up going, I'm a feminist now, it still allows them to go, okay, I'm more of a feminist when I let my kid go to school, or I support women getting to school, or even though I recognize some parts of the movement are going too far.
Yeah, I thought it was a little bit ironic that our first episode is on feminism and all three of us are guys. But hopefully, like, this will hopefully normalize the idea of having men talk about women's issues as well, and being open enough to sort of acknowledge the kind of troubles that they're going through, especially like when we're talking about different strands and how they might conflict with each other. Like, fighting for equality is already so hard for women. But I'm going to make a limited resources argument of sorts. So basically, this is about clout. So if we have, like, hypothetically, if we had a slut walk movement in KL, and a lot of the attention given to women and the feminist movement in general on social media, on the news, or in public forums, wherever, would be focused on the slut walk movement. And if we had, like, leading feminists in Malaysia, like, talking more about the slut walk movement, focusing on female empowerment through how they dress, and normalizing women being able to make the choices that they want, like sexually express themselves however they want. How would this play a part on the amount of resources or attention that should be allocated to making sure all women get equal education, or have the ability to access certain loans, getting a scholarship, getting a job? Wouldn't this be a diversion of all of, like, the resources or attention?
So let me first help your argument a bit. One good example of how this has occurred is the LGBTQIA rights movement in Malaysia. The thing about queer empowerment, internationally at least, is that it has often been based off the, sort of overcoming of repression and overcoming of shame, really, and so you've had the Stonewall riots fighting for pride and fighting for the right to be seen and to express one's sexuality openly, as compared to having a more repressed society. However, internationally, as in Malaysia, for example, this sort of coverage of the queer community has meant that the conservative society especially links being queer with this specific lifestyle, which is not necessarily a link you can draw logically, right? Like, it's not like the moments you are attracted to men and you are a man, you suddenly enjoy, like, you flaunting it on the street. That's the general that's this general association that conservatives often draw, but isn't necessarily true. The danger of what I think you're arguing for is that women or feminism might end up turning up to be the same way, where because or if feminism ends up being about this sort of open expression of female sexuality and the more even the more finer parts of the feminist movement, which seem even more alien to conservatives, this will then ensure that conservatives link feminism with the most extreme or the most alien possible parts of it in their eyes. In my view, it depends. So in order for that to happen, the story you told had to have a couple of parts, right? Part number one, the feminist movement does that. Part number two, feminist scholars or feminist figureheads in Malaysia end up talking about that rather than anything else. And part number three, conservatives end up buying into it. I think that it is a possible scenario. Like, I'm not saying it cannot happen, but in order for that not to happen, in order for us to be able to get the sort of discussions about female sexuality going, which would still be valuable in furthering the feminist movement, you might want to try to break the links between number one and number two, for example. While major feminist figureheads might acknowledge the issue and the attention it draws to feminism, they can also point out, look, this is important, but here's another feminist issue in Malaysia, right? And you can point out, for example, the very, very pressing concerns that women often face in Malaysia, such as child rights, or such as female genital mutilation, or also known as female circumcision, that is still a practice being done in Malaysia. And they could also point out things like educational opportunities for women in Malaysia. These are all of the other fights of feminism that I don't think that the feminist figureheads would suddenly stop talking about the moments a slut walk happens. And I also, this is going to sound a little bit condescending, but conservatives might end up just going, aha, they did something wrong, and therefore I don't have to accept this new idea. And to a certain extent, that is something that conservatives enjoy doing, really. They're finding any excuse to go, I don't want to believe in this. But my answer is simply be very careful about whether or not that slut walk ends up becoming the only part of the movement, and also really whether or not slut walks are really the only way to go, right? Like, that's one, but third wave feminism has way more things than slut walks, which are very valuable and could still be included, right? Like calling men up for catcalling, sexual harassment, changing language in a way that is more like individual rather than confrontational. Like, okay, hey, haven't you ever thought about how weird it is that we use the word slut as compared to the Bachelor? All of these things don't have to be violent or open displays that conservatives will go, aha, see, you're doing something wrong. But they could also be more inclusive, and feminism could be about making life better for everybody, really. And that's something feminism could also do.
Yeah, I guess to be fair, we're not really in danger of well, I wouldn't say exactly in danger, but like third wave feminism to the extent of like supporting the slut walk movement isn't really yet apparent in Malaysia. I think leading feminists in Malaysia would probably be like Nurul Izzah Anwar and Marina Mahathir, and at least by Western standards, they're still fairly conservative. They're not extremely liberal to the point where they are all out for that, Cardi B, Beyonce kind of female empowerment.
WAP.
Yeah, WAP.
Yeah.
I knew it was going to come up somewhere.
Of course, I freaking love that song.
Of course you would.
Oh my god.
And this is where second wave feminists will go, aha, you're objectifying women, and Cardi B will be going, no, I'm objectifying myself. It's okay. It also depends on consent, and like she consents to it, and she's openly saying, this is my sexuality, I'm owning it. So.
Yeah, so I don't really think that, at least in Malaysia, we don't really have a problem with the hijacking of a feminist narrative, especially since all of the different waves that are present in Malaysia don't necessarily contradict or conflict with each other, at least not yet. I haven't seen anything where people are just against feminism, like not outright at least. But obviously, we have a lot of barriers preventing women achieving equality or equity in many areas. But yeah, so any final verdict? Should we be supporting third wave feminism in Malaysia? Should we let it be how it is, the third wave that it is? Or should we just say, let's focus on ensuring everybody has the same first? So basically, we talked about how there are different waves of feminism, um, and specifically how some of those waves are very relevant to Malaysia, especially when we look at the geographical distinction in multiple areas in Malaysia. And then we also talked a little bit about whether they should exist in stages, whether we can have these different waves coexist, and whether they conflict with each other or not.
Yeah. So I personally still think that feminism should go forward in stages. So I think there are quite a lot of ideas like supporting this factor in today's discussion. So one of them was this idea of limited resource, and that people can only subscribe to certain ideas of what a movement looks like, and therefore you need to prioritize the more important things like whether or not women get enough money to like sustain themselves without the need of depending on their husbands, right? So these sorts of ideas obviously hold more weight in terms of the options that they give to women and the freedom that women are afforded through these sorts of fights. So I still think that while in a more opportune in a more opportune world, Malaysia will probably be able to fight for all of these things at the same time. I still don't think that the feminism movement should be able to deprioritize these fights in order to fight for something like such as the slut walk movement, right? Other than that, there's also a danger, particularly in Malaysian politics. That's another discussion that we're going to have in a later episode. But there's a tendency for people to paint certain movements as a singular idea and attach all sorts of fights that you fight pegged on that one singular idea. So we see this, we painted to you like the example of like westernization, right? Where we take certain bits of culture of like very hedonistic bits of Western civilization and we demonize it and we say that all parts of Western civilization are like this. If we have a feminism movement that supports the slut walk, obviously many members of conservative societies that are religiously backed and which have a lot of relevance, especially in conservative areas in Malaysia, will directly link feminism as an ideology to solely be about this one single idea which they find unacceptable.
And I win because because I have more faith in humanity. I think that we ought to not progress in waves. I think that we should fight every single fight that we can, because the trick isn't to try and get more people to say I'm a feminist. The trick is to get more people to do things that are feministic, and you can still fight for educational equality while at the same time having movements that fight for beneficial things for women all across the board, not being sexually harassed, not having not having asymmetrical language or toxic forms of masculinity. All of these are fights that I think people can still argue for without necessarily hurting the feminist movement as a whole. And even if we get to a situation where a conservative person is more hesitant to say I am a feminist, because feminist ends up becoming this big revolutionary package really that includes all of these things which conservative people might not be comfortable with. I think the arguments persuading them to send their children to school or to support equal wage would still work regardless of whether there were strands of other ideas attached to them. And that's why I think that fighting on all fronts is a good idea.
So that's it for today. I hope you guys learned something new, or at least hopefully understand the arguments that people make or you make yourself a little bit better, and you're able to take part in discussions a little bit more confidently. And hopefully it will also help you make better decisions and have a better idea of what feminism is about in Malaysia. So that's it for today. We'll be back really soon.
And don't be a dumbass.